Flashes of light and colours all bled into one another, and for a second I thought I was back home again. It wasn't at all any sort of familiarity of appearance or even a sense of comfort that led me to this belief, but a deep, inconsolable longing for home that made me want to believe that I was. Sadly, it was swiftly replaced with a stomach-churning realization that I was back at his flat. It was a stash of drugs exposed on the bedside table that reminded me of the hell I'd walked myself into. I couldn't complain. It was my fault. I stretched a bit in bed, and as I turned over on my side to look over at the window, I squinted at the discomfort of having the harsh morning rays of sunshine sting my eyes. Then I got up. Time to start a new day. My name is Kate Miller, and I'm 32. I'm a youth advisor from the UK. This is a piece I've written about my teenage years to my early 20s, where I was involved in gang crime. I want to use this as a cautionary tale for those who idolize being popular or doing dangerous things because they want to fit in with their peers. I also want to use my own story to hopefully inspire those who are currently in a bad situation in life that there is hope to being a better person and reintegrating into society. The real dead ends are where you've given up hope and have stopped yourself from progressing. Have you ever wondered what life would have been like if you did or didn't make certain choices? What direction your life would have taken and the things you would have gotten to do or even missed out on? Maybe you feel like you would have had a better life, better experiences, and you would have been happier or richer. Maybe you would have had a better job or better relationships. I wonder that all the time. One of my biggest regrets in life is just that, not taking the first opportunity out, being stubborn and delving deeper and deeper into that sickly web of lies, hurt and frustrations, struggling like a fly as their power over me grew. I felt my own strength fading as she took over me more and more, that side of me that I never wanted to surface. Life changes, we all know that. Well, my life changed so much in 5 years alone that in my early 20s, when I would look back at old photos from before I started changing, from before Mark came into my life, or should I say when I desperately planted mine in his, I looked so happy and young and misguided. It made me realize for a split second that there was a whole world outside of it all, and I was once a part of it. Life was normal. I hated that, so I would shut my eyes and carry on if it meant I didn't have to accept the dire straits I was in. Age 17. It all started in school when I met Mark. He was popular, friendly, and likable. He may have also had eye-catching looks, but the most appealing thing, or should I say alluring thing about him, was his personality. One short conversation with him and you would be hooked. When you talked to him, you could listen to him speak for hours. He was that interesting and easy to talk to, in the beginning at least. But he was also a bit withdrawn at times, making him all the more mysterious. He seemed to be close enough to talk to, but whenever the conversation topic was focused on him, he gave very short and even at times snappy responses. I felt captivated and wanted to know more. But at the time he was just too out of reach and talking to him seemed a bit impossible. Everyone knew that you couldn't just approach him. He was in one of those groups, if you catch my drift. The popular kids that you just didn't want to catch the attention of. Because if you did and it wasn't because they liked you, well, let's just say you weren't going to have a very good time. Well, they'd approached me before, and it wasn't because they liked me either. They hated me. The girls especially had such a vitriol for me that they wouldn't even say my name. They just laughed in my direction or swore in my direction, and I knew they were talking to me. It was for this reason I was a very lonely girl in my teenage years. The bullying and singling out in particular had started in secondary school, around year 9, when all the girls had begun noticing that the boys were always giving me special attention. You see, I guess by conventional standards, I'm considered quite beautiful. In those early days, I was always surrounded by boys and had tons of friends. In fact, I was quite popular, whatever that meant for a 13-year-old. Back then, when I was popular, all my friends and I would have massive sleepovers where we'd gossip and laugh, watch movies and stay up late to tell stories and discuss the dreams we had for our futures. Maybe that's why I was so shocked when everyone turned their back on me when I had a falling out with Myra, Tia and Eloise. They were the most popular trio and basically pulled the strings behind everything. They were friends with everyone and everyone worshipped them. Their opinion mattered the most, and if you wanted to fit in, you needed to be on good terms with them. Eloise came from a rich and powerful family and got so spoiled that even as young as 11, she had always had the newest iPhones, clothes, and makeup. She had everything a girl could ever want and more, yet she always had a sour, disgusted look on her face. I mean, she was pretty enough in her own right, but I could still see that she hated me, and that was because she was jealous I was prettier than her, to put it bluntly. Myra was another member of the trio, and she was absolutely boy crazy. She would joke around and hang out with me sometimes whilst we were still friends, but she would become bitter and annoyed when another boy would come up to me to speak to me and completely ignore her. Over time, she'd hang out less and less, and I would see her hang out with Eloise, giving me weird looks, and when I would walk up to her, they'd be awkward and distant. It was then that I began to understand that they had begun making jokes at my expense behind my back and treat me like less of a friend and more of a frenemy. Tia was the last of the trio and arguably one of the worst of them. She was sly and everyone knew it. She could smile in your face, ask you how your family is, invite you to a party or offer you to sit with her, but behind the scenes she would completely trash everything about you to others and you would hear about it days later from strangers. That's probably why she was the least popular of the trio and relied on Tia and Eloise to remain relevant. But she used that to her advantage by making it so that anyone who wanted to get close to them had to be nice to her first. In the beginning, I was so shaken that I didn't really want to acknowledge that I wasn't respected and popular anymore. I guess it was my ego, but I tried a few times to suck up to them so that they would forgive me and we could make up, but it never worked, however much I tried. I knew I was being pathetic, but what could I do? I had to try. I tried talking to all my old friends as well, but to no avail. Worst of all was that I was also supposed to get a scholarship, but Eloise's rich family used their money and influence to bribe the school into giving it to someone else. It was over. I'd lost it all. Luckily for me though, Mark wasn't like the rest of them, or so I thought back then. He was intelligent and inviting, but he also sat next to me in my English class, which meant that we sat next to each other for at least an hour at a time, 3 times a week. That hour felt like heaven at the time, and instead of focusing on my lessons, I would sometimes just go into deep thought, thinking about ways that I could just strike up a conversation with him, just hoping he would give me a chance. And one day, I found the perfect opportunity. Mark was confused with something to do that we were studying, and I used it as the perfect excuse to jump in and help him. Remember, I actually sat next to him, so I offered to help, and Mark's face seemed to light up from his often dazed and withdrawn expression he had when he thought no one was watching. He was so happy, in fact, that he actually invited me to a party that was coming up and said that I just had to come and that he'd been meaning to invite me for a while anyways because I seemed cool and he wanted to get to know me. This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for so long. I finally had the opportunity to get closer to him, and on top of that, I had the chance to get closer to the popular kids, and maybe I could try and be friends with them now without the risk of getting on their bad side in school. It was the evening of the party when I was getting ready and Mark over text asked if I needed a ride, and I was so excited at the idea of Mark driving over, especially for me, that I immediately replied yes. I was quickly disappointed though to find that it wouldn't just be us, as he'd actually be coming with some of his acquaintances. His acquaintances, I'd later learn, were actually some kids in the years above ours who were known drug dealers and had records. They certainly weren't the ideal people to better yourself with and keep company with. They also weren't the ideal people to know your address. As I got into the car, shuffling next to some strange guy who looked a bit too old to be keeping company with teenagers and reeked of cigarettes, alcohol, and something else, I felt the most uncomfortable I'd ever felt. Nobody could have told me the sweet, trustworthy, and charismatic Mark of school was hanging out around such questionable characters outside of school. Or maybe I was just being naive. I mean, I actually didn't really know that much about him besides the fact that he was 17, he was kind of popular, and we sat next to each other in English. But even with how uncomfortable I was and how many red flags were going off inside my brain, I still felt excited that I was finally about to associate with all these popular, mature people, and I was most excited now that I had the opportunity to get closer to Mark. He said it himself, he'd been wanting to invite me for some time. We finally got to where the party was at, and I felt a bit better when I saw that it was just some normal house in a normal neighbourhood, and it actually wasn't too far away from my own home, So if there was an emergency, I'm sure Mark would just be able to drop me off. I got out of the car to feel the cool nighttime air and stretched a bit before walking towards Mark, who just got off as well, and as I walked towards him, I could already feel something was off. He was acting weird, less polite and introverted maybe. I couldn't put my finger on it, but he just wasn't his usual self. It was like as soon as we walked in and he was swarmed by people greeting him, he became more extroverted. Or maybe the word erratic would be a better way to describe how he started acting. You could easily say he was just happy and more open as he was in a party atmosphere. That's certainly how I rationalised it at the time, but now I'm not too sure. With everything that's happened since, I couldn't help but feel like his sudden change in demeanour were signs that he wasn't who he presented himself to be. Actually, I'll tell you a little secret now. The drugs had kicked in. That's why he changed. He'd taken a pill right before he came to my house and I had no idea. I was naive, that's for sure. She goes to the party and for the first time encounters drugs and alcohol, but she thinks that people who drink and smoke are more mature and cooler than her. She tries to smoke, but it feels wrong for her, so she stops and Mark laughs at her. They hang out at the party and Mark kisses her even though she's uncomfortable, and then tries to rationalise it as him asking her to be his girlfriend. She's happy as he is popular and she feels this will elevate her social status at school, but in reality she feels like she's becoming more and more distant to who she really is. Over time, Kate's mum, Amy, began picking up that Kate was changing for the worse. She noticed that she was eating less and focusing more on her appearance, began speaking less at home, and when she did, she had a snappy attitude. At first, she assumed Kate was just acting out as she was a teenage girl, but over time, her concern for her daughter grew, and she was more and more anxious about what was happening with her. She decided to ask Kate herself if there was anything wrong one day, but Kate shrugged her mother off and acted like she was being strange and overdramatic and seemed to be in a hurry to go off to school. This was it for her, the final straw. She decided one day that she had to take things into her own hands for her daughter's safety and well-being. While Kate was in the shower, Amy decided she would sneak into her room and check her phone. Luckily for her, Kate hadn't thought of putting a passcode yet. She looked through the phone and decided to check who she was talking to. A new name she'd never seen before, Mark. To her horror, she saw something she'd warned her daughter about, and that was Mark soliciting illicit photos from her. Kate had said yes, and she asked him to wait for her to go to the shower and come back before she would take some. Kate's mum had no idea what to think, say or do. She could have sworn her daughter knew better than to do something like that, but in this case she was proven wrong. When Kate came out of the shower and got dressed, she saw her mum standing in the corridor with a noticeable scowl on her face and Kate's phone in her hands. "Young lady, how do you explain this?" She held up the phone with the messages there. Kate was surprised her mother found out and was mortified she knew about her and Mark. "That's none of your business. Give it back now." "Absolutely not. I'll be taking this and don't you dare talk to Mark anymore. You're grounded." Kate was in utter disbelief. Actually, this had been the first time her mother had even told her that she was grounded and decided she wouldn't have any of it. "I don't care what you think. I love him and I'm going to be with him." And with that, Kate violently snatched her phone from her mother's hand while her guard was down and ran down the stairs, her mother running after her, but it was too late. Kate was out the door in seconds. Angry and hurt, she runs away to stay with Mark, who takes advantage of her vulnerability and began manipulating and abusing her by turning her away from her mum and family, as well as dragging down her self-esteem by constantly telling her she would be prettier if she was thinner, wore more makeup, wore specific clothes he wanted. He also begins pressuring her to do things she doesn't want to do sexually. However, soon enough she finds out that he isn't who he said he was, and finds out he's actually one of the worst members of his group and is involved with gangs and has recently begun taking harder drugs. Worried, she tries to go back to her family and study for important exams that will determine her future, but he manipulates her into staying and partying with his friends by sobbing and crying, saying he'll fall apart and drop out if she leaves him. Also implies he'd hurt himself, so she'd feel obligated to stay. She doesn't have much in common with them, but forces herself to stay so she can fit in and be liked, but also because she's scared for Mark's safety. Age 18. She secretly becomes closer with a few of them who she actually has stuff in common with, Anthony, Liam and Joshua, who support her and hate how Mark is treating her. They always hated him and think she deserves better, and by that they mean themselves. They all have crushes on her because she's so pretty, but whenever she talks about something she really likes, they patronize and mock her, causing her to feel insecure and drift away from her past hobbies. They don't like Mark because he's getting in the way of them being able to get closer to her. Liam. He was initially weirded out by Kate in secondary and made fun of her in private, but was peer pressured by Anthony and Joshua to make friends with her, and became infatuated with her when he saw she'd gotten more attractive over the years, and was the most keen on wanting to impress her. Mark continues to verbally and even sometimes physically abuse her. He's extremely jealous of her friendship with Anthony, Liam and Joshua, but can't say anything as they supply him the drugs he wants at a good price, and could be a threat to his reputation if word gets out he's doing harder drugs. He also physically restrains her from leaving the house before checking what she's wearing first, leading Kate to begin wearing clothes she really wants underneath the ones Mark checks, and then changing in public toilets. They begin lying to each other more and more. Kate becomes anxious for her safety after Mark has a bad high and gets extremely violent, even giving her bruises. She calls a helpline under a fake name and they help come up with a plan for her escape. But Mark finds out and blackmails her with her own illicit photos and says if she leaves, he and a couple of his female friends will spread those photos online. She has no choice but to stay, and her classmates begin cyberbullying her, as well as real-life bullying in school. Mark smugly tells them to stop and says she knows her place now. Kate begins to hate Mark and vows to make his life as hard for him as it has been for her, partly in jealousy that he's had it so easy all these years being so popular. She begins sneaking pills in his drinks which make him feel more ill than he already has recently while experiencing withdrawal symptoms after he got cut off by Anthony. He begins throwing up and getting convulsions as well as numbness. She also began ridiculing him to Anthony, Joshua and Liam, who laughed at him while he was laying on the floor in agony, whilst also beating him up on Kate's demand for threatening her. Mark is starting to feel more disconnected from reality and believes Kate and the trio is plotting to kill him. He tries to stay away from her, but they still live together and he sees them while they visit. Mark feels less and less safe, more paranoid and more unhappy. He fake apologizes for threatening her, but it's too late. He knows he's made an enemy of her. Mark had begun trying to quit drugs after having a relapse. One of his friends passed away after an overdose and he was waiting to get rid of the stash and break the cycle. The final draw was when Kate began using his already unsafe substances and even upgrading to more illicit synthetic drugs. She convulses into a seizure and barely makes it. Then she laughs in a sinister way and Mark realizes Kate isn't who she was. After an explosive argument between the two, he tells her he thinks she's not who she was and leaves her in a panic. He feels bad because it was him who made her this way, but deep down he knows he's at a different stage in life and vows to change his own ways. Kate is disturbed and distraught that Mark has left her and her grades begin to slip. She is made to retake the year. Age 19. Depressed and unmotivated, Kate drops out of school and becomes more and more intertwined with the world of crime. She becomes a kleptomaniac and would frequently steal from retailers. She would also run drug errands for Anthony and became particularly close to him as well. It was Anthony, after all, who convinced her to join Ender's Mandem, along with Liam, Joshua, and after they became closer to the leader, Grimm's Reaper. Shortly after joining, she earns their trust by committing various low-level crimes. The leader likes her and everyone else does too. The leader gets killed by a rival gang and Kate, with the help of her beauty and charm, rallies enough support by playing on the grief felt by those who'd been loyal to Grimm's and climbs her way up to the top of the hierarchy by independently taking charge and getting revenge on those who killed the leader, earning the support of the rest of the gang, but doesn't get her own hands dirty, though she still feels a sense of deep shame within. Note: Kate doesn't kill at all, but she mainly orders them to destroy property and beat up members who were responsible. After much thought and despair when thinking of what she had to go through in secondary school, Kate decides to get revenge. Eloise is chosen as the first and is tracked down with the help of Joshua, who was a mastermind with technology and heard Kate's story and wanted to do something to help. She sends anonymous warnings to her on social media, and a panicked Eloise flees to London to her boyfriend's flat. But the gang uses their connections there to have her beat up. They then take photos and spread it online, humiliating her and her rich family, who'd once humiliated Kate by stealing her hard-earned scholarship from her. It was bittersweet, but it felt good to Kate. As the saying goes, revenge is sweet. Age 20. In a shocking turn of events, it turned out she didn't need to go look for Myra, as she realised when sneakily looking through Anthony's phone one day that he knew Myra, and by the looks of it, very well. She confronted him, and he was surprised that she'd looked through his phone, but answered anyways that he'd been on and off with her for years. She started sobbing, and he held her, asking her what was wrong, and she knew that she could take advantage of the situation to get revenge without lifting a finger. She started weaving him stories, some true, some exaggerated, about Myra's role in Kate being singled out and bullied. Anthony was mortified and angered when he heard of this. He always thought of Myra as a strong, carefree spirit who never cared what the group said or did. True, she did mention something about being ashamed of her past, but never quite realised how bad it was. Something snapped and he flew into a rage, vowing to Kate that he would make sure she paid. He stormed home and nobody saw him until a couple of days later with bruised knuckles. He wasn't the same after. He stuck by Kate much more after that. Some may call it loyalty, some may call it obsession. Whatever it was, Myra had paid a mighty price. Her once pretty face was now decorated with bruises, and she hung her head down in shame. I'd heard she'd begged Anthony to stay and wondered why he changed, but it was no use. He was bragging to all their friends about how she was begging him to come back even though he'd beat her to a pulp for what she did to Kate. I won't lie, I felt a lump in my throat when I saw her. I don't know what I wanted to happen to her when I told Anthony, but seeing her across the street so humiliated and broken, I would be lying if I said I didn't feel for her. I felt humiliated by someone I loved too once, Mark. Anyways, I moved on and went out for drinks with the guys. No time to be sulking when I should be celebrating. Kate was in her new apartment one day when she began recounting the story of a dear friend she made in secondary school after everyone had abandoned her. His name was Noel. He was insecure in his teenage years and had a crush on Kate and was extremely frustrated when she rejected him, so he stopped talking to her. He was extremely hurt by the rejection, and Kate was hurt when he stopped talking to her. She'd lost her only friend and was all alone again. She snaps out of her daydream and checks social media to see that she's received dozens of horrible hate comments under her photos, a big blow to her self-esteem which she'd begun rebuilding. Well, more of an ego from being told she's so beautiful all the time and using it to her advantage. But anyhow, she was shocked. She also saw that she'd received loads of private messages from the user threatening her with a bunch of old private information only those she was close with would have known. She had a few suspects but never would have guessed who it really was. Now she was furious and demanded to know who crossed her, so she enlisted the help of Joshua again to track the user through their IP and hunt them down. When they found the IP and background information of the user, however, they were shocked to find it was none other than Noel Bright from Year 10 himself. She gave him a call later that evening to confirm what she'd found out, and although he denied it at first, he seemed to quickly become bad at lying when she relayed some private banking information to him, which would be bad if others knew about. He broke down sobbing over the phone and said he'd loved her all these years and was hurt when she rejected him and wanted her to feel some sort of pain, the same type of pain he'd felt. She recoiled in disgust when she realised that he'd probably been contemplating whether to do this for years. A pathetic attempt it was, she thought. She found out the moment he started, and he barely got any satisfaction either. It was all for no reason. His feelings of hurt and betrayal were misplaced and taking out in the form of bullying her. He was a shy, overweight and depressed boy who had finally found someone he could be free around, and when he opened up to her, she rejected him, and it broke him. He couldn't get over those bitter feelings embroiled deep within and decided the best way to let go was for her to feel some sort of the pain she had felt. Kate was disgusted because she knew the feeling all too well. She'd felt the same way with Mark. When Kate found him, she exposed him online and he had him shamed online. That was her being merciful. His girlfriend wasn't too pleased. He'd been stalking another woman and left him shortly after. However, Kate spared him the one humiliation of having his banking details exposed. She knew he had money issues and worked to provide for his younger siblings, and decided leaving them vulnerable like that was just a step too far for her. The same girl who had her bullies beaten to a pulp decided to have mercy this one instance, just once. Age 22. At last, Kate finally found her last victim, Tia. She'd been waiting for so long, and it was hard to track her down, but the satisfaction when she finally did was unrivaled. She was the slyest, most unlikable member of the trio. I'd never really been friends with her, so I felt the least bad for her when I was getting my revenge. I wanted her to go away. She hated me, and I couldn't even say I felt that much for her. I had a gun, I had a confidant, I had a plan. I would get Liam to plant a gun in Tia's bag and corner her into a situation where she'd be stopped and searched. Yikes. It sounded harsh even to me, but I was resolute on having all three of them humiliated. It didn't even matter that I myself had begun to move on. This was just closure for me, as sick as it all was. It was around February, I think, when it happened, around midnight. She'd been walking home alone that night after having gone out partying with her mates. She was intoxicated, and if I'm being honest, in the awful state that she was in, it was hard not to suspect she hadn't taken something else as well. Well, she actually unknowingly had. We'd followed her to a house party, and Liam snuck the gun into her purse in the 2 seconds it had taken her to get some refills with her friends. He slinked past and snuck it into the depths of her bag. A small pistol, barely noticeable. He then hid a while longer for her to need to use the restrooms and snuck some drug in her cocktail. She came back and drank it up, even said it tasted better this time. I crept behind her next to Liam as she walked, never in a position where she could see us, but always where she was in our view. We gave an anonymous tip to the police that there was a suspicious figure walking down the street at midnight, concealing what looked like a weapon. Then we waited and hoped they'd come. They did, and we stood and watched as she argued with them in her inebriated state, swearing and then hitting. This was serious. She was out of her wits. It was obvious enough. They decided to carry out a stop and search, and when they did, they finally found the gun and the extra drugs he had planted. Her eyes grew wide open and she screamed and almost pleaded with them to understand it wasn't hers. But no matter what she said, the evidence was right in front of their very eyes. She was taken into custody, and we heard later that she was going to be charged with the possession of illegal substances and illegal weapons. I was in deep trouble. I caught someone out of the corner of my eye who I recognized to be a member of the rival group. The rival group. We had been beefing with them for many years. They were always out to get us, and if any one of us ever got caught in their territory, you were done for. I must have had the worst timing, made worse by the fact that I was well known. I was the Enders' leader now. It was just a one-time thing. I was just shopping in that area for Christmas gifts, and now my life was in danger. It was the most fear I'd felt in ages. Her name was Ria. She was a well-known figure in their group, notorious for being quick to recognize, and she had bright red hair that stood out even more in the grey of the winter festivities. And she had no qualms to kill. She'd stab you in your tendons so you'd be sure to die a very messy death, and she'd leave without a trace. I'd heard police had been looking for her for a while. She absolutely wasn't someone I wanted to get caught by. Her eyes flashed as her recognition flooded in. I ran for it. She probably started to, as I could hear her slamming herself into the crowd and swimming through it like nothing else mattered anymore. Her objective was to kill me, or at least have me injured to the point where I looked unrecognizable. It was amusing though too, as I wondered if she'd come to buy presents too. I bolted out of that shopping centre in an instant and ran into the crowd gathered on the high street, enjoying the festivities, decorations, food stalls and music. It was so pretty I almost forgot what had just happened and changed my appearance a little with a scarf and a hat that I quickly bought. Walking past the shops decorated with snowflakes and snowmen, I rekindled that sense of childhood wonder I once had. Flashes of light came in the form of memories, an ember of fire as me and my parents sat around the fire. I began remembering memories of my past, my happy childhood, where around this time of year I was usually playing tag with my cousins or making gingerbread men. We would tell stories around the dinner table with extended relatives who'd come from far away to visit. Those were my best memories. I walked a little further and jerked forward in shock out of my nostalgic haze and back into reality. You're probably thinking that I saw Ria and was concerned, but in reality I saw something much more peculiar. It was me, I was sure of it. Though I only caught a glance from behind, I knew exactly who it looked like. Me, from 10 years ago. I ran up inconspicuously and stole a few glances. I was mystified. This was clearly me. Or a doppelganger? I'd heard stories about how we were all supposed to have 9 around the world, but I never imagined I'd just run into mine at a Christmas market while getting hunted down by a gang member. Tears welled up in my eyes. The girl was a spitting image of me when I was 13, back when things were simpler. I had friends, family, I worked hard in school to get good grades. When Tia, Myra and Eloise cast me out the way they did, all I remembered thinking was how great it was going to feel to exact my revenge. I felt more broken now than I'd ever been. I'd somehow not only managed to lose the good things, but the bad things too. Mark, I wonder if I'll ever see him again. Tapping on the ground, the sound of exasperated pants growing louder and louder. Uh-oh, Ria. She'd caught up and I was in full view. She lunged at me with a knife at full force and I'd almost resigned myself to my fate. However, it turns out fate had other plans. A hand clawed at my jacket from my spine, pulling me away. Stumbling backwards, I panicked, flailing my arms, trying to balance myself, and I was about to fall until a familiar figure caught my shoulders, propping me up. I turned slowly, or that's what it felt like. I was pumped with adrenaline after all. No, it couldn't be. Mark? I'd gasped, breathlessly trying to compose myself. I nearly just got stabbed after all. Is it really you? There's no time for that. I'll explain later. He looked concerned. Ria had somehow lost us in the crowd and a few police officers happened to be in the vicinity. They were closing in on her, so she left in a hurry. I'm sure she would have continued to search for me if they'd not scared her off. Maybe I'd be dead. It was Mark who helped me. Mark. I couldn't believe my eyes. Are you alright? You look so pale. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said. I was still in disbelief, but I followed him to a cafe where we ordered a couple drinks and sat down to talk. How have you been? I finally asked. Not too bad, I guess. Got clean, went back to school. Now I'm a manager at a restaurant. You? Well, I was just about to get stabbed, so I'm not entirely sure. I felt dreadful, but surprisingly he laughed. Even I can't say I've been there before. But hopefully it'll get better. You need to be honest with yourself. If you want real change, you need to be prepared to let go and heal. You know what it's going to take, and you alone can make it happen. We made small talk a little while longer, but not the awkward kind. It was nice. It was obvious we'd forgiven each other for the past and were hopeful for the future. I'm so grateful because even though it was me getting involved with Mark that started this whole mess, it was also him that helped me get out of it. We said our goodbyes and went home that evening. And I sat in my flat, staring out into the lonely, cold, deserted streets as it rained a thunderous rain, and I knew what I had to do. The next day, I walked over to the police stop and confessed my role in the crime organisation that I was a part of. It was hard, especially since I myself was never fond of snitches, but I had no choice. If I was going to break the cycle, then I had to dismantle the cogs in it. I had to be the change no one was prepared to commit to. My stomach dropped when I was told Tia couldn't have her sentence dropped, even once I told them that it was really me who had ordered Liam to put it in a bag. They said it didn't matter, that even if it was planted, that if it was found on someone's person, they had to be charged. I was crushed and regret filled me to the brim with shame and self-disgust. It was too late though, and what's done is done. I was going to have to live with what I'd done, and even though I could never fully redeem myself, I had to do something to make change happen. I took the deal. If I gave the name of violent criminals who were known to put the lives of other people in danger, then I would be given a lighter sentence, with the opportunity to clear my record in time. I knew if I was going to make a change that I needed to be in the community working on the ground. It was hard to give the names of friends and enemies alike, but I knew it was for the best. I knew what they had done, and it wasn't innocent people I was exposing. These were people who would openly brag about beating someone to a pulp, stealing, killing, abusing, framing. I needed to swallow my pride and do what I needed to do. After the interview was over, I sighed a breath of relief. I'd been carrying so much on my shoulders and I hadn't felt so light in so long. I knew what I was doing was necessary, so I allowed myself to soak in those feelings. There was no use doting on the past. The future was what was most important. They let me go, saying I'd receive a letter about my trial, so I walked outside in the winter air for a bit, and even though my ear was going numb from how cold it was, I felt a strange warmth for once. I recounted more memories from when I was growing up and smiled bittersweetly, thinking about how I always used to get up when I fell down and would brush the dirt off my knees and carry on merrily along my way. That was what I wanted again, to be able to brush the dirt off my knees and move on. All wounds would heal in time. Near the end of my 23rd year, I contacted my old friend Noel. I wanted to see if he was alright. Even though he was the one who chose to bully me online, I always felt a sense of pity for him. I felt a connection to him. After all, I too was once an outcast, with no one to rely on. I wanted to reach out one last time, and even if he hung up on me upon hearing and recognizing my voice, I just wanted to know if he was alright and to let him know I forgave him in case his actions were weighing on him like mine were on me. I dialed the number into an old payphone as I was walking back from the police station. It was gloomy out again, but I was too nervous to care. I just had to know. I just had to know how he was. Ring, ring, ring. It rung over and over to no avail, and I'd just about given up until what I suspect was the phone box's very last effort. On the very last ring. Hello? Hi, it's me, I whispered bashfully. May I ask who's speaking? It's Kate. I'm sorry to disturb you, Kate? Oh wow, it's been a while, man. How have you been? We left off on pretty bad terms. I know, and I just wanted to say how sorry I am for how I handled it. Even though what you did was awful, what I did was equally as bad. I have no idea if you're okay, but I just wanted to call to make sure. Make sure? Okay. I'm okay. If you're worried my life is terrible because of what you did, it's not. It's not? Oh, thank God. I sighed, a blissful sigh of relief. I had confidence issues because of my weight and mounting pressures to provide for my family. I somehow managed to convince myself that all troubles in life would simply disappear if we were to go out. I idolized you in an unhealthy way because I was so depressed, and when you turned me down, it sort of shattered all my hopes for things getting better. I'm so sorry. Don't be. Seriously. It was not my place to put that on you. I was only thinking about myself with no regard about how you must have been feeling. We were each other's only friend in hard times, and I ruined it. So your life is actually better than it was. It's amazing, actually. I actually confronted my confidence issues by deciding to get back in shape. I committed to working out and eventually found it was my passion. I'm a celebrity personal trainer now, and instead of hiding behind my past like it's shameful, I use it to inspire my clients that they can make it too. I'm so happy to hear it. I hung up. I knew it was rude, but I didn't want him to hear me cry. These were happy tears, though. I must have been radiating like a lamppost because this conversation was everything I'd ever wanted and more. I felt inspired and excited to take on the future. Mark and Noel had once both aided in making my life miserable, but now inspired me to turn it around. The powerful message I took from it all was that even some of the worst characters from my life weren't truly bad people. They were a victim of the circumstances they had been given, and even they had championed it. My trial came and went like a fog. I still got a sentence, but it was reduced due to my cooperation, and the judge understood that I was ready to do good once I came back. When I was released sometime later, I worked on going back to night school while working part-time in order to finish my A-levels. Eventually, through hard work and dedication, I went to university to get a degree in health and social care and got my record wiped, going off to work as a youth worker with the aims of helping those who'd been through traumatizing experiences in life. I want to spread the important message that we are all capable of doing amazing things, even in the darkest of times. And even when it feels like we're the villains in our own story, we all deserve to give ourselves a chance to prove to ourselves that we can be better. This has been Kate, and thank you for listening to my story about how I got myself out of a wrong crowd.